yourselves very briefly for the benefit of both members of the panel and also anyone joining us today. So firstly, Dan.
I'm Dan Spicer. I'm Strategy and Partnerships Manager at Sheffield City Council, providing support to the board.
Thanks, Dan. Abby.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Abby Brownsword, Committee Secretary for this meeting.
Terry.
I'm Terry Hudson. I'm co-chair of the committee and chair of Sheffield CCG.
Maddie.
I'm Madeline Ford, Chief Executive at Voluntary Action Sheffield.
Judy. I think you're on mute, Judy, if you just want to unmute yourself. Cheers.
I'm Judy Robinson. I'm chair of Sheffield Health Watch, the independent watchdog for citizens about health and social care.
And Catherine.
I'm Catherine Robertshaw. I'm Deputy Director for Delivery for the Accountable Care Partnership.
David.
David Warwick, Governing Body GP, Sheffield CCG.
Greg.
Greg Fell, Director of Public Health.
Mike.
Mike Potts. I'm the chair of the Sheffield Health and Social Care Trust. And Jane Brown, I think, used to attend this meeting, representing, I think, a non-exec from the providers. And so I'm here in that capacity. Very much the new guy. I've only been in post for 6-7 weeks.
And yes, especially welcome to Mike in your first meeting here. Mark.
My name is Mark Tuckett. I'm Director of Sheffield Accountable Care Partnership, and apologies in advance, I need to leave the meeting at 4:15. That's why Catherine and I cover for the full meeting.
Brian.
Good afternoon, I'm Brian Hughes. I'm Deputy Accountable Officer at Sheffield CCG.
John Doyle.
John Doyle, Director of Strategy and Commissioning of the People's Portfolio in the City Council.
Una.
Una Jennings, District Commander, Sheffield, and I think I claim the title of being newest. I've been here about 6 weeks, so it's my first meeting. Thank you. And again, have to leave at 4:30, so thank you.
And again, welcome to Una. We've had a lot of input in the past few years from Stuart, predecessor, so we really welcome Una as well to this meeting today. Claire.
Hi, Claire Mappin. I'm Managing Director of Burton Street Foundation, so I represent voluntary sector providers.
And Tony.
I'm Tony Schwartz. I'm Dean of Health, Wellbeing and Life Sciences, and I'm here representing the universities.
Thank you all. That's everyone who's appearing on my screen at least. So I apologize that took a little time, but having a couple of new people in the room, I think, was a worthwhile activity, especially we are in public today. So firstly, can I just ask, have we received any noted apologies from anyone for this meeting?
Thank you, Chair. I've had apologies from Alison Metcalf. Tony Schwartz is representing her, Councillor Jackie Drayton, Councillor Paul Wood, and Sarah Story as well.
Thank you so much. And then looking at our agenda today, does anyone on the committee have any declarations of interest on any matters that are arising? Speak up if so. If not, I'll assume there are none. We've also got I also understand some people will be joining us a little later in the meeting today, and some people may have to leave us a little early, and that will become evident as we go along. So now I understand that we have some questions that have been submitted in advance today, and what I'm going to ask is if they can be brought virtually into the meeting. I hope they'll be able to ask their questions, and then we'll seek to respond to those.
Can I just check, George, you want to take a particular one first?
No, I'll leave that to you to decide which order you wish to admit people. Assuming that everything that's needed is there, we will just admit them in any order. And I'm not sure which questions were submitted first.
I'm going to bring Howard Gordon into the room.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Welcome, Howard. Do you want to ask your question?
Good afternoon, everybody. The strict criteria for the disabled persons council tax reduction and bus pass discriminates against some people living with dementia and other disabilities. The only qualification for a school under 24 older persons bus pass is age, yet people with disabilities face significant barriers to attain equality of services and attain their rights regardless of diagnosis under international law via Articles 9, 19, 20, 25, 26 and 30 of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities through the strict criteria that is imposed on them. Will the Health and Wellbeing Board act to ensure that Sheffield City Council upholds the rights and protected characteristics of people living with disabilities under international law and remove the strict criteria from the Disabled Persons Council tax reduction and bus pass, replacing the criteria with a person's diagnosis, thereby redressing the inequality that someone with a disability face in this and other matters? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, Howard. I think that raises obviously two serious issues about entitlements. I'm not certain whether there is anyone in the meeting that will be able to give you a comprehensive response, but clearly there's something that Greg may be able to give an answer. But clearly there's also something we want to make sure you get a really good response to after the meeting.
If I could give you a quick bit of background.
Very briefly, if you can.
Yeah. I was diagnosed with dementia 3.5 years ago. I qualify for the bus pass because I cannot drive, but I don't qualify because I don't get any benefits.
Okay.
And the same with the council tax deduction, the criteria, I can't meet the criteria on that. So a lot of people are finding that, especially now with people with dementia being diagnosed at the earlier stage, they're not qualifying for benefits and things like that. So our rights aren't being met by these criteria.
Thanks, Howard, for that. Can I bring Greg in? I think Greg indicated, and then move on there.
Thanks, George. I'm not sure I'll give a comprehensive answer. It's well beyond my area of expertise. A number of us had a brief chat with a number of officers in the council. In short, two things. One, the relevant service manager has offered to discuss with you in person whether or not you would qualify and or if you've been reviewed and what course of action will come next. Secondly, the eligibility criteria we have to follow on disabled persons travel is based on Department of Transport guidance, and we assess whether or not customer applications are based on that guidance on behalf of the PTE. On initial skim, and as I say, we'll follow up with a personal conversation, but on initial skim, we don't think we'd be in a position to remove any of the criteria as the customer suggests. But as I say, we'll follow up, one, with a written response, much fuller written response, and two, an offer to put you in touch with the service manager who will know what they're doing, because it's well beyond certainly my area of expertise. And then if that's not satisfactory, we'll follow up from there, if that's acceptable to you, Mr. Gordon.
Yeah, that's
okay.
fine.
Thank you very much for answering the question. I think it's a serious question and something I'll be personally obviously trying to look into after this meeting as well. So thank you for raising this there. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dan, can we have the second questioner if they're available? Is that okay? Thank you.
I can't see them in the list of attendees, so I don't know whether we want to just read out the question.
I'm happy to read out the question, and if that's what people want. Just give me 1 moment, I'll make sure we get that in front of. I'll get that in front of me. And so this is Natasha Wilson that I believe is the next questioner. So Natasha Wilson's question is about visiting care homes. She says that I'd like to pose the question as to how the city is facilitating essential family visits to people with dementia in care homes. Even with the rise in infection rates and COVID positive homes, it is of a paramount importance that people in their last months or summer, winter of their lives are allowed to have some degree of quality to it, which involves having loved ones surrounding them. And there's a link to a campaign, which someone has launched a digital review called John's Campaign, and that's at johnstowncampaign.org.uk. She asked if it'd be useful for Sheffield Care and in terms of a minimum consistent standard approach. As is here for the foreseeable, I'd like us to explore ways of updating friends and family, e.g. all homes to redress their media consent protocols, for and have Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups for individual homes or better specific floors, newsletters for people who aren't online, and some other suggestions. And also, could a new role be created for a member of existing staff or a volunteer to lead in facilitating this? I seemingly remember an update being sent in May and June from SEC asking for social care staff to volunteer themselves for this. So it's the free care staff for care tasks, but she's not aware that was taken up. We have got a response here from Joe Horrobin, who is our head of commissioning for adult social care. It may also be something that Greg wants to offer a comment on. I might just start myself by saying this is a really, really difficult area, and it is, I think, one of the things that we hear, in my post bag at the moment, and I know in Greg's, there is an awful lot of contact, because we absolutely understand why these issues matter very much alongside the task that Greg is leading for City in keeping all of us safe. So I'm happy to outline the response from Joe Horrobin, unless Greg wants to comment first.
I'll unmute myself. Two things. One, I need to go and let my daughter in because I've left the key in the back door. She just got home from school, so I'll be quick. There is a full written response, and I've been in touch with Natasha on a number of occasions, both online and elsewhere. This is the hottest of hot issues in my inbox. I think a few observations. We are facilitating essential visits. Two, we've very clearly given some advice and some support and some guidance to the care home sector, and we're working within the government guidance on that one. We're absolutely respecting the independence of the independent sector, and in short, we are trying to balance the undoubted benefit of visiting with the well-trod and well-documented risk of what happens in care homes when infections set in and outbreaks set in. We've seen that before, and we don't ever want to go back there. So it's an exceptionally hot issue in my inbox, very emotive, balancing sort of the benefits versus the risks in a legal and a very, very emotive environment. Yes is broadly the answer to almost all, I think, of Natasha's questions. And Joe Horrobin, who put together the written answer, is putting together the approach that we're taking as a city, which is developing and evolving all the time.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, I'm not proposing to read out all of Joe Horrobin's written answer. That naturally we will share that with the question in the committee, but absolutely outlines that we have got a task group in Sheffield which is looking at this and absolutely trying to approach the challenges around technology and around access. I think it's really, really important to underline what Greg said. Absolutely, we are facilitating visiting in Sheffield in line with government guidelines. This is then naturally a really difficult area. So we will obviously share that full response both with the questioner and with the committee if we can do that. Thank you. I believe that brings us to the end of our questions, and thanks. We don't always get public questions like that here, so it's really good to have that engagement. So I'm really pleased to see that. And that brings us on to our first substantive element of our agenda, which is on our the rapid health impact assessments. I don't know who we've got here to present today.
I'll start, Dan. Eleanor Rutter.
Start, Greg.
Yeah, Eleanor Rutter is going to do most of the talking, and I've clocked that she's just appeared on my screen, so I figure she's there. Just by way of introduction, the paper was circulated a wee bit late, for which I apologise. This was a commission that came from the board. We discussed it at the last meeting in March, I think it was. The ask was to document the impact of COVID-19 on the city in lots of different shapes and spaces. We framed that in the context of the health and wellbeing strategy. No surprises there. It was a rapid-ish set of analyses using available evidence. Has been a significant exercise, a really, really huge exercise. And whilst Eleanor is on point to talk us through it, it's been a huge team effort. I think she'll say almost 100 people, or probably more, have been involved in this from lots of different areas of services, areas of policy and responsibility. The full analysis, which I think we have spared you from, but we will be publishing it somewhere fairly shortly, is 350 or so pages, and Eleanor's going to attempt to summarise that in the following presentation, for which I wish her the best of luck. So, with no further ado, on to Eleanor.
Thank you, Greg. Yes, welcome.
Hi,
Eleanor.
thank you. I just need to try and share my screen because I've got some slides here. Are they there?
Yeah, can see.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so thank you very much, Greg. I'm not going to try and summarise the 350, 400 page report. Unfortunately, I couldn't possibly do that today. But I am going to try and talk about particularly the overarching themes that have come out of this report. So what do I want to do? We'll whiz through the background, because I think we all know what that is, and whiz through what the 13 original themes were. I want to talk more about the overarching themes, because as this work develops, we've been round and round and round in circles as to how we should cut it, because each theme fed into every other theme, and I think you will understand why if you've read the paper, hopefully. I will take questions if I'm able, but as Greg said, actually, when I wrote on the paper, this was around 100 people. Having looked again, it's way more than that. This is the work of about 200 people, a lot of it very specialist and very detailed. If people have questions regarding the specific themes, we might have to push them off to theme leads and task and finish groups, but I will kind of do my best. And the other thing is that Catherine Robertshaw is here, and she's been quite involved with this. I think she's here with a different hat on today, but she may be able to help me out when it gets to questions. The bit I really wanted to take the time with, really, was the discussion with you guys on the board, talking about there's a couple of questions there in the paper, but talking through the recommendations as well. So, the background. I don't think anybody will have missed the fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. What we perhaps weren't ever expecting was that we would nearly be a year into the pandemic. I think when we started this piece of work, the pandemic still felt quite new. So come December, the pandemic will be a year old. Almost 1 million people have died worldwide. 40,000 in the UK, and almost 450 of those have been in Sheffield. What we learned very, very rapidly at the beginning of the pandemic was that this virus was going to affect our most vulnerable the worst. That was our significantly elderly, the people who were already unwell, and we know from discussions we've had at the board before that they tend to be from our most deprived communities, and BAME populations. I'll just say right at the beginning of this, I'm not going to talk about the BAME part of this. One of the themes that was looked at was the BAME population, but Sarah Hepworth is going to come and talk about that specifically afterwards, so you don't need me to talk about that. In addition to the impact of the COVID disease itself on our most vulnerable communities, it was clear right from the start that lockdown was going to impact the worst, the most vulnerable communities the worst. And of course that hit a city which we know has a background of very wide inequalities in health, and on the background of years and years of austerity. So there was a phrase thrown around at the beginning of the pandemic, the sort of "we're all in it together," which of course was just a rather disingenuous truism. And the best analogy I'd heard was that we're all weathering a storm at sea together. Some of us are in great big ocean-going liners, and other people are doing it in old, damaged rubber dinghies that are overloaded. And I think it's a brilliant analogy for both the pandemic and the lockdown. So I think you will remember I came here in June to discuss the health impact assessment, which was going to be an attempt to have a systematic look, as rapidly as we could, at the impact on health and wellbeing across the city of the pandemic and the lockdown. The aims I've put there were to initially we were thinking about providing an evidence base for the recovery, and we did talk about managing to respond to a potential second wave far better than the first, if such a thing were to come. And of course, as time passes, we realise that that isn't an if, that's a sort of, I was going to say a when, it's not a when, it appears to be a now. So just moving on, as we discussed this at the when I came in June, so I don't spend a lot of time doing it. The work was divided into, well, we were looking at 13 key areas, which were raised by stakeholders across the city of particular concern or interest. When we got started, we were absolutely determined not just to not to just be a mapping exercise where we were just mapping kind of surge capacity for future services. We wanted to look at the good. We wanted to document the good and the bad, and see if there were new ways of working and things that we could build from moving forward post pandemic. And it's absolutely clear that there are some really, really good things that have happened out there in Sheffield through the pandemic. There is a lot to build on and learn from. But I think when we look at the entirety of this impact assessment, let's make no mistake, the overall impact on Sheffield is quite devastating, both the pandemic and the lockdown. There are some good things. I just wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that loads of people will have realised there was cars were off the roads, a lot less pollution, and a lot more people cycling. A lot of good reactions in terms of health behaviours. So gambling shops, betting shops were closed. A lot of people stopped gambling. Education, learning from home. Lots of children, particularly those with SEND, actually found learning from home a really positive experience. One of the best stories that I heard doing this work was in housing. Actually, we just took people who lived on the street off the streets and put them into proper accommodation, and people reflected that they never experienced such a thing, and have some great stories coming out of people living in hotels across the city. And one particular story that has just struck me as amazing, a guy who just took the opportunity to come off drugs, has been a lifelong drug user, but given that his usual dealer couldn't get to him because he wasn't on Fargate, he wasn't constantly being given drugs, and he took the opportunity to get clean. So there's loads and loads of really, really good stories, but as I say, a lot of really tough things as well. The cross-cutting themes. So as you will gather from those sorts of themes, all of these things fed into each other. But also, as the work started to be done, it was really clear that there were certain themes, certain topics that were coming out of each theme. The first thing, inequalities. And actually, somebody described this really nicely. In the sense that they said, you know, if COVID-19 had a purpose in Sheffield, which is a bit desperate really, it has had a disproportionate impact on all sorts of different communities, but has had, you know, all of these themes have had the greatest impact on our most vulnerable, and whilst we can't measure it directly, is going to have widened inequalities across the city. Probably the most positive thing to come out of the whole piece of work is the response of neighbourhoods and communities. Been absolutely incredible what the sort of formal and informal voluntary sector have done, stepping up, caring for their most vulnerable within communities. And I think that is the greatest thing that we need to kind of learn from and build on moving forward. Sheffield has certainly shown us how resilient it can be and how caring it is. So that's an absolutely brilliant outcome. But also people are tired and do need supporting to support each other. So we can't just assume that neighbourhoods and communities can just care for each other. Digital inclusivity, people who were digitally excluded had less access. There was quite a lot of agility coming from all sorts of parts of the city, new ways of working, new ways of learning, new ways of contacting each other, social contact, all those sorts of things. A big chunk of the city are still digitally excluded, and so they were excluded from a lot of our efforts to maintain service giving or an informal contact. So again, that's had a impact on inequalities. Mental health. It's almost ubiquitous, actually, that this pandemic and lockdown has had an impact on people's emotional well-being. So people with formal mental health diagnoses, this has been much harder for. But lockdown has removed a lot of the means by which we all maintain our emotional well-being. So the effect on people who were previously considered themselves to be to have good mental health, there's been a negative impact there as well. But it's traumatic for many people. Many people have lost family members, in some situations multiple family members, in incredibly traumatic and unpleasant circumstances, in the sense that they couldn't visit and be with people as we would like people to be together at the end of their lives. The other thing that we mustn't forget is the impact on the staff, on staff's mental health and emotional well-being. Staff have gone above and beyond in all sectors in response to the pandemic, and are physically exhausted, but also the emotional impact on staff as well can't be overestimated. Access to health and care. There've been some really good news stories there. Services working well together, services working remotely, offering new ways of working. So a lot of good things to come out of that, although again, not brilliant for people who are digitally excluded. But there are some good news stories there. Obviously, across the board, there was a lot of health and care delayed, and there's going to be a great big surge that we do have to deal with as that comes back to normal, or as we move into recovery. Employment and poverty, more furlough and the potential for more job losses in our most deprived communities, which obviously is not great news either for the city or for those people. A massive increase in use of food banks, which and the impact on employment and poverty is something that obviously we've only measured over the last few months, but moving forward, that's got the impact to have a negative impact on the city for months and years to come if we're not able to mitigate that. Consistent theme coming out of this was comms and engagement. I think we've all struggled getting messages out, but people are very much responding that too many messages. Often people are finding the messaging confusing. They don't really know what's happening. And of course, the other thing is that we are not always culturally competent, and we're not always communicating with our most vulnerable communities in the way that we perhaps should. So we need to kind of keep working on the comms and engagement. Limitations and gaps. The rapidity. I feel so proud of the people that have done this. It's incredible the amount of work that they've done and the quality of this piece of work in this amount of time. That said, we wanted it done quickly in order that we could respond better to a second wave. If you go quickly, you exclude things. You don't include as many people as you could. It's not the quality that it could be. So there is all sorts of things lost with it being done as quickly as it was, but it was in real time, and we've tried very hard to capture what people in Sheffield were experiencing through that time. Similar point really, it was contemporary and it was just for those 3 or 4 months, and we know that the impact of this is going to be ongoing and it's going to change. So we perhaps need to have a think about how and whether we want to continue looking at these things moving forward. Lots of missing data, partly again us going very fast and what we could get hold of, but another thing, and I think Sarah will talk more about this, particularly in relation to BAME, so much data that we don't collect. which we need to. We don't know what is happening with our vulnerable communities if we don't gather the data. And some of the data, I feel quite ashamed. You know, we're looking at data that's 10 years old, and making statements about a city that is active and changing. And so I think we need to think about that. Not dissimilar, missing voices. It is far easier to hear the voice of people that talk loudly and make themselves heard, and we need to make a far greater effort to make sure we're listening to our seldom heard communities. That said, there's a community survey has been out, and we've extended the time that that's out, which is why it's not part of the report today. It's going to stay out until September because we have been getting a lot of responses to that. I've thrown in dental health at the bottom there, just to make the point really that when you go at something rapidly, you do what you think needs doing. And with great shame, it was about, it was very recent that Greg actually said to me, what about dental health? And I thought, oh yeah, we've not done dental health. The last time I was taught about dental health, my understanding was that it was the thing of all things that expresses health inequalities the most, a number of decayed, missing and filled teeth in children. And what we've had here is 12 weeks of people grazing on sweet food. And again, our most deprived children missing out on their toothbrushing clubs at the start of the day. The fact that I didn't think to include dental health, I think speaks volumes, and just makes me ask, did we miss anything else? Is there anything else as important as that we just didn't think of, and that didn't get included for that reason? I hope not, but shout up if there is. So, 13 themes, 103 recommendations. It's a huge amount, I am aware of that. And this is what I said at the beginning, we can't do justice to that number today. They're a mixture in the way people have approached their recommendations. Some people there's a lot of recommendations that are short-term, absolute response to this pandemic. We need more of, we need to do this differently. A lot of people have picked up on the inequalities thing, and recommendations sound like, well, we need to do what we said we would in that plan that we wrote 10 years ago, or this strategy that we wrote 5 years ago. And then the other type of recommendations are the really big things. We need to be a city of active transport, a city that excludes inequalities, etc. So very different approach. I didn't want to squash the recommendations into one form because we really wanted these 13 themes to say what they thought needed to be done, not what I thought would sit tidily into a report for the board. So that's an absolute whistle-stop tour. I don't know if anybody wants to ask any questions at that point, or if you would prefer for us to move on to kind of questions for the board and perhaps a discussion about the recommendations.
What I'm going to suggest, Ella, is if we just remove the whoever's sharing, I can't remember who's sharing at the moment.
It's
remove
me.
that.
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you just stop sharing for a moment, and then we'll ask for the questions. It's much easier for me to manage that process.
Yes. Oh, stop sharing.
Without
Yes.
the sharing. And
Okay.
then if we'll return to that sharing after we've had any questions, if that's okay. That just probably best if people can either put their hands up or message me or whatever you want if there are questions. Obviously, keeping in mind what was said by Ellen around that detail, but obviously do ask the questions, and obviously Ellen will do her best. I've got Judy at the moment, and then anyone else can signal if they want. Judy can bring you in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think some really useful and interesting and worrying data in all that. Just a couple of questions. One is about the number of recommendations. Clearly they're not all priorities, and they are of a different kind, aren't they? Some are big strategic, some are much more practical. So I wonder if there's any more work to try and hone those down into themes. That was one. But the other one was, and I think I mentioned it before, Health Watch and other organisations are also collecting information and feedback and so on. So I wonder if there's an exercise to at least try and look for common themes. Since you mentioned it, I know Health Watch at least 12 weeks ago said, because we heard it, dental services are an issue. So it seems to me if we don't look at those multiple sources of information and feedback, we're more likely to have blind spots. That's a way to stop that. So 2 questions.
You want me to answer that now, George? Not.
I think given that, if you can, and then I'll bring.
I will if I can. Other people might say otherwise. The point about the recommendations, Judy, I would totally agree, and actually was kind of hoping for a discussion with the board about this. I did not want to squash anybody into a tidy shape of what we wanted recommendations to look like. The overarching recommendations, you will see the first one for the board is note the full set of recommendations and endorse their delivery via appropriate governance structures. So there's kind of 13 themes. There's all sorts of boards and structures out there that we would like to push those smaller recommendations into. But I think as a board, we sort of need to think, particularly, what do we do about the bigger ones, the overarching ones? Because I think that first set of recommendations are much, by far the most straightforward ones. What do we do with the overarching blue sky thinking, the what do we want to look like in 10 years from now type recommendations? And I think that's what we want the board to discuss really and give us their thoughts on that. With regard to the work Health Watch are doing, I would love to come to have a look at that together when our community questionnaire has reported, and maybe we need to bring the 2 together. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We need as much information, good qualitative information as we can, and make sure we're trying to look at it in the round. So I would say yes, please. And I'd also like to ask if the board would be happy for us to come back and report on that at some later date when we're ready.
Thanks. Greg, did you want to respond on that? I've got a couple of people on the list, but if you want to respond on that, I'll bring you in.
Just very briefly, picking up where Eleanor left off. I mean, it's a hugely helpful piece of intelligence. I agree with Judy about better integrating lived experience in some of this. That goes without saying. We're not as good at doing that as we'd like to think we are, but I think we should keep working on that one. Ultimately, for me, this becomes part of the joint strategic needs assessment for the city, which is month by month, keep adding things to it. All of our agencies, all of our institutions, all of our organisations use that in various ways to inform their commissioning and or delivery intentions, some of which very, very, very directly, some of which far less directly. This just simply becomes a set of intelligence that we use in our commissioning and or delivery intentions, or our policy formation intentions. And I'd probably not oversweat now how we deliver recommendation 64 or recommendation 32, because there isn't the time or space for that. I think that the commitment for the board is that we use this as we continue to implement the health and wellbeing strategy, which is the thing that this group of people is responsible for, and individual bits of our organisations or whole organisations to take this evidence in ways that's helpful for it.
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to bring Maddie in now.
Thanks, George. Like others, I think it's an amazing piece of work, Eleanor, and the volume of the insights in there is just fantastic. One of the things that I struggled with, because I think it's the way my brain works, is kind of grouping those things together so that we can distill it into the high-level principle. Here are some high-level objectives and then the specific actions within those. And I'm sure it's to do with the speed that this was pulled together, but there seems to be a few inconsistencies within that sort of hierarchy in the report at the moment. So you mentioned the fantastic response from communities, which I think has been amazing. But then when you look at the recommendations across themes, it comes out in a slightly prosaic, very specific way about let's think about how we can support mutual aid groups to go forward. That is part of it, but I think it's much bigger than that. And the way it comes out in the cross-cutting themes, I think, is much stronger. And I think there's something about how we build resilient communities in Sheffield in the broadest sense, which I think so there's let's build resilient communities, let's think about the actions in there, and then the more specific stuff. I wonder if one way to get at that kind of grouping is to go back to our strategy as a health and wellbeing board. And we've got 9 strands, can't remember what they're called, areas. And I think that those 9 strands of our health and wellbeing strategy probably correlate quite well to the themes and recommendations coming out in this report, and that might give us a bit of structure to help us move it forwards. It also then gives us a ready lead to look to start synthesising some of the information coming through and coming up with maybe short, medium and far actions, which then enhance that strategy and take it forward and bring those two pieces of work together.
I think if I can just respond to that, I would totally agree with that, Maddie. And again, it's been the speed of this piece of work. So we've had and for about the last 3 or 4 weeks, as these recommendations have been coming to me, I've been trying to make sense of them and structure them in that way. And it's been actually melting my brain. And I've discussed it with so many people. How should we do that? And actually, the final answer was, well, I need to discuss that with the board. It's not, all I've done is bring this piece of work together and I'm reporting it to you. But I had a very helpful discussion with Dan, who understands the health and wellbeing strategy, and said this maps onto the health and wellbeing strategy. We might need to kind of tweak some of the work we're doing within it, which I think is actually what Greg's saying as well. When we have more time, I'm certainly happy to, if the board think it's worthwhile to think about how we structure the recommendations. But yeah, lacking in time, I thought the most honest approach was, I've just got to list these and let you guys see how broad people's approach has been to this.
Thanks. I think that point does actually treat to some of the kind of question side that we'll be hopefully considering in a moment of how we move on from that, because I think that's a very good point. Mark, if we can.
I think others have commented on the recommendations, and I would say similar things. I did 2 thoughts. One, are you clear about where to go with each of these recommendations? And because there won't be any one group that's implement or action or all 103 or however they end up getting clustered. And I think for some of those recommendations, it will be clear where to take them. For some of those, it won't be clear at all. And I wonder whether that might help inform where we might want to have slightly longer conversation. I was struck by something you said in the presentation as well, Eleanor, about part of the thinking behind this work in the early stages was to inform what a subsequent potential lockdown might look like. And as we're sort of looking at restrictions on public-private lives, as well as sort of thinking about those recommendations, are some of them, you said long-term, medium-term, short-term, are some of them actually really quite urgent? So are there some lessons from this work that as we move into the next few weeks and months that actually we would want to be considering, and are you confident you've got the right routes to share and make those sorts of recommendations?
In response to that, Mark, it's the detail of this work that I don't, I'm not steeped in well enough to know exactly. But yes, some of it is urgent, some of it needs doing. We still have some of the delivery structures that were set up at the beginning of the pandemic. So, for example, the end of life group, citywide group, is still meeting, and they're just doing stuff. They're doing what needs to be done in an integrated way, which is great. In terms of, do I know where to plug it in, how to get it all done? I was giggling as you said that, because I thought, no, but I know a man who does. And I was thinking exactly that we do need to have a think about the ACP and other structures and where we put this. But I personally don't know. No. But this is going to be a citywide thing. I mean, when we talk about where we share this with, I think it needs to go, personally, I think it needs to go bigger than the usual structures in which we work. So I need lots of help and input from other people to think about where do we go and take which bits where.
Yeah, I think that's a very cogent point. I think I've seen this meeting right here for a while as the start of the stuff that needs to be done rather than this. Greg, do you want to respond specifically in that before I bring Terry in?
Very briefly, I think the board members have to take responsibility for helping kind of direct the eventual findings to wherever they need to get to in all sorts of shapes and guises. I'll certainly take that responsibility. Eleanor, I had a brief conversation. The full 350 page, the full mashings is it's a bit messy, because it's been difficult to pull together. It's been done by different people. And I've said to Eleanor, we are not going to pull it together to make it all beautiful and pretty, because being brutally blunt, both Eleanor and I have got other things that are burning quite a lot of our time at the moment. So and I'm going to recommend that we don't try and make it all beautiful and pretty, because it won't change the fundamental facts within it. So and we'll just post it on a website somewhere, probably the council website, maybe the Health and Wellbeing Board website. Doubtless there'll be forms I've got to fill in to do that, but it won't be the pretty version. It will just be as it is, and hopefully everyone's comfortable with that.
Thanks, Greg. Bring Terry in, please.
Thank you. So firstly, thank you to Eleanor and those 200 plus people who are involved in bringing this together. Certainly, I think it does give us a very strong insight as a city into what's been going on, and reflects the very difficult time lots of people have had, but also some of the benefits that Eleanor has highlighted. Picking up on Greg's last comment, I would also support not trying to make this into a perhaps more simplistic, nice, pretty looking document, because I think there is a danger there that may well cleanse some of the nuance that has come out from that sort of different groups putting forward those different views. However, for the recommendations, I do think that there is potentially some benefit in grouping them together in a different way. I think there are immediate local things that we can do. I think, as Ellen has reflected, there are probably slightly bigger structures, so sub-regional or regional things that we need to be able to link up with to be able to influence that. And dare I say it, there will be national things that we need to plug into that simply we won't be able to achieve on our own as a city. I'm not going to get into the specifics of which recommendations I think might need looking at in a bit more detail. However, so I'll go with the positives first. I think, there's a strong theme coming through there that we respond in a system and in a partnership way. And I'm certainly very keen that we keep that essence there. I think the themes around inclusion are very important. I think the themes around making sure that we address inequality and also equalities are important. And I think the key point on communications, how do we get one set of messaging out to our population is certainly something we need to act on fairly quickly. There are some recommendations in there, though, where I'm raising my eyebrows and wondering, are they the right recommendations, and are we talking about the right organisations and right places potentially to take those forward? And I think there might be some nuance around statutory responsibilities and organisational accountabilities where there's been a bit of blurring in some of those recommendations. And part of that is the nuance of legal things and different mandates that we need to pick up on. So it's not to object to things like consultations, but we need to be really clear as a board that we can't mandate an organisation that actually has statutory accountability to do something in a set way. However, the essence behind that of us, responding and engaging with the population in a more systematic way and as a group of partners, I'm fully supportive of.
Sorry, Eleanor, do you want to respond to anything there?
No, totally agree. I mean, I think what I'm hearing board members say really is the recommendations, it would be helpful to kind of put the thought into looking at them differently, restructuring them, reviewing them, as I've kind of known over the last 3 or 4 weeks. I think we do need to think about who's going to do that. And I suppose I was thinking it needs to be a group of people, doesn't it? It needs to not be a me thing. Partly because of the time limit thing, but also because it does need to be quite citywide. So I'm agreeing that it needs to be done. I suppose what I'm asking is, please don't assume that was a volunteering myself.
Thanks, Eleanor. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring Brian in, and just if anyone else wants to signal me, do now. Otherwise, then I'll ask Ellen to respond, and then move us back to those questions if we can, and then we'll look at how we want to conclude this for today. So, Brian,
Thanks,
please.
George, and thanks, Eleanor. And I'm not going to. Well, I probably am going to make your life slightly harder because I like the rawness of the recommendations, and I think it reflects the time that we're in, and the time that it has taken to do this, and that's where the 200 plus contributions are. I think there is something about that theme and system ownership to those themes. So how do we as a set of organizations start to own some of this? And the reason it sort of makes your life slightly more difficult is, and it's not done in isolation. So we've heard both Maddie and Judy talk about, there are other bits, there are other sort of intelligence out there as well. And the one bit that I'd make sure that we need to make a really close alignment to is the State of Sheffield report and the findings that are in that. And a lot of it is similar in terms of some of those recommendations. So there's a richness that a lot of it we knew, but let's think of a way of how we connect all those documents and all that intelligence together. And that's where my olive branch to you is, I think it's not just you, it has to be us as a system in starting to own these recommendations and start to distill what's relevant to us and what's relevant to us in our wider sense as well.
Thanks, Brian. Ellie, you want to respond to that at all? And then if you can move us back to that question slide that you had, then we'll see how we can consider those. Thanks.
I don't think I have any response there, George, other than saying, yes, I totally agree. I thought for a minute, Brian, you were going to say it's not just you, it's us. I thought you meant you and me. I thought, no, all of us. So, yes, I totally agree with that. And obviously, I'm absolutely happy to be part of reshaping these recommendations. I just, we need to be clear. It's another wide job that needs to involve, a lot more people, or it needs to have a wide reach, I think is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Thanks, Eleanor. Do you want, if you are able to share with us those slides with those questions you had, and then I just want to use those if we can consider how we want to how we want to move on from here. That's great.
So there is the questions, and the recommendations come on the next slide, which is sort of something you probably need to discuss as well.
Yeah. Let's just, because what I think with these, and I'll take any contributions just in a moment, is that we have heard from contributions we've just had quite a lot that does they answer address some of this stuff. And I think what I'd just offer for myself before we move into the recommendations, I think we've heard a lot about the fact that we need to broaden this work. We need to bring quite a broad group of people in to make sure that first question, can be answered. And we've heard some suggestions about which groups and stakeholders, but perhaps what I don't think we're going to do through our member contribution today is come up with that comprehensive list. Clearly we could go on everyone and we could all offer those groups and stakeholders, some of which or many of which you will have thought of, Eleanor, but perhaps we need a swift process by which a slightly more comprehensive answer to that second question can come with. I'll make comments on that in a moment if there are any, but do you want to just flip to your recommendations slide?
There we go.
If people want to read those, I believe they seem fairly self-evident. I haven't heard anything that beyond reasonable criticism of the way some things are. It feels like to me, and obviously I haven't read the 350 pages. It feels to me that there's broad support for this in this group. I think we're all along we felt it's necessary, and I think in what we've seen today, heard from Ellen, and what we've seen in the report, I'm sensing broad support. I mean, I don't know if there's any dissension from that. And it's really about the how and the how of delivery. In terms of, and I'm going to invite comments on all of this in a second. And I think it is evident with a report of this magnitude that it has to impact on what we do. I think, and then those last two are kind of do follow on from what's been said. I'm just going to ask Terry to comment on this or indeed on the answer to questions previously.
So I'll come on to the 4 specific recommendations on this slide, and I'm going to start from the bottom upwards on this one. I think the Health and Wellbeing Board can support the development of a communication strategy, or certainly influence that across a wider health and wellbeing landscape. And I think it's something as a board we should support. I would question whether we can support the delivery of it. I think that might be something that might be more relevant to the people who are going to be giving out that communication. I certainly support using a future development strategy to consider these findings in more detail. As we've alluded to, this is a really lengthy document, and we are seeing the more high-level parts of that today. So I think some discussion around some of the more detailed parts of that I would certainly welcome as a Health and Wellbeing Board. I think we can incorporate the evidence base generated through everything that we're doing. We've already said that this should form part of our kind of strategic needs assessment, and certainly I would endorse that approach. The final point, noting the full set of recommendations and endorsing their delivery, is where I'm slightly more cautious. Recommendations, be clear on what the role of this board is in terms of how we hold that to account. And I think there are some nuances that I picked up on earlier that, I think the wording of some of those recommendations might need to be a little bit different, so that it enables us as a system to take that collective ownership of it. There are a few bits in there, sort of relationships with the ICS, monitoring some of our engagement with people. And for me, I can see the consistency of approach across South Yorkshire and Bassetlaw being a helpful thing, but actually we need to be clear that the accountability for that lies down in organisations in Sheffield. So I think that needs a little bit more work, and perhaps considering using that future development strategy development session to look at the paper in more detail might also be the place that we look at those recommendations in a bit more detail. And certainly I would be happy to commit in.
No, that's
okay.
No,
Sorry,
I was just going to say thanks for the offer, Terry, of help. I was thinking exactly the same as you were talking. Could we discuss how we get ourselves in a position where the board could endorse the recommendations? Could we do that in a future development session? That seems really sensible.
Can I just come in briefly, Chair? Sorry, just on the back of Terry's question as well. So I think keen to be part of that conversation too, because there's a huge amount of material here, and what I think would be a real shame is that if not too few people have got the time to read all 350 pages of content. And so I'm sure there will be a way that we can, across some of our organisations, think about maybe different versions of this, different clusterings. We've talked quite a bit about how we might look at some of these recommendations. And I just think that across our system, and if you broaden that to include universities and space and a research base, ought to be having a really big impact in Sheffield. And I think we ought to be able to find ways of doing that.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm going to bring David Worker and anyone else that wants to contribute. Sorry, you're going to have to put your hand up on the chat. If you're waving at me, I probably won't see you at the moment because they're all about 1 inch wide.
I was thinking that I guess the difference between us as a board sort of promoting and the the sharing of this really useful information, and as opposed to us endorsing the content as being perfect. Because I think the latter will involve us bickering about wording and things like that. And I think that it's a really useful piece of information that I think that maybe we should be making sure that gets out there to our partners. And another thing is, I guess it would be useful for me, knowing our board's sort of strategic ambitions, that we could find out which of these recommendations map to our strategic ambitions, and a lot of them do, and then that for me helps me clarify what is my business as a board member, or what our business as a board is, because there will be some recommendations that make a lot of sense but aren't actually our business as the board, health and wellbeing board, but maybe the business of individual members and our partners in place or whatever. But that's sorry, that's my ramblings.
Thanks, David. I'm not seeing anybody else right now. I mean, that's Eleanor wants to say something. What I think the point made by Terry, Mark, and David there makes sense. Clearly, not to be critical, clearly the recommendations, I think, reflect them. They are almost where they're very, very reasonable recommendations that we want that we would like to get to. But clearly there is a bit of a process that we need to get to be able to do that, I think. And as Terry notes, there are some elements which we just might not be able to fulfill. So I don't want to remove the I'm not saying we should. I don't want to remove the feeling of the recommendations off the table today, because I feel that, you know, there is something broad. I mean, there's something very broad about this, about the whole process, that we've always supported, will continue to support, and we have absolutely no doubt that so much of what has happened and the intentions and the direction here is really positive, and there's that kind of ongoing endorsement of that. But absolutely, both in terms of specific actions and in terms of adopting all the recommendations, we do need to find a way through to do that. I don't think I've heard anyone that's suggesting that we should be kind of taking this kind of what feels to some of us both have a leap in the dark, because it is such a comprehensive thing. We need to quickly find a way of doing that. I know it's the situation we often find ourselves in Health and Wellbeing Board, that actually we often have to try and find processes to synthesize, to understand quite complicated issues, and both alongside our own strategy and work, but also to try and endorse and consider things which for which it is not possible always in a board meeting to be able to receive the full detail of which such a comprehensive piece of work like this is one of them. So I think I'm just wondering if, I mean, I don't know if anyone's got a firm proposal of what we can say today, but I think what we absolutely, I would probably absolutely commit to today is that we endorse what we've heard today, and commit to working as quickly and efficiently and as widely across the system as we can to understand, endorse where possible, and promote those promote those findings. But clearly, as people have noted, there are some elements of the action and some parts of that content which we naturally can't commit to at this moment for evident reasons. Are people comfortable with that? Or, I mean, I'm happy to take further contributions. And, you know, the office of people like Mark, who is always offering to do things for us, which I'm very grateful to be involved, and Terry, and what we need to do is we need to go out there, and we need to find a way of getting the information in front of all of us, our partners, and finding a way to come back to us. I do feel we're probably going to need to come back to this at a future board meeting very soon, in order that this doesn't get lost, because I think I've heard some very, very important points today, that this is really important now, and the impacts of this will be greatest the more swiftly we can move to make sure that that we can adopt and promote this. So are people happy? I'm happy to take further contributions if people got other points or slightly different points of view about how we should move on for this. I know that feels a little woolly, but I absolutely take the point. I completely agree that we can't be going for, we can't put too firm to the full thing now. We need to work through that swiftly with partners. Okay, I'm not seeing any dissent from that. People can shout out if they want to. Other than that, I really want to thank Eleanor both for all the work that you have led, as you say, nearly 200 partners to do. And I'm sure it's not over now. And as you say, you need a wider group of people to really help you push on that. And I think on behalf of the board, we can say we will do our best to help achieve that for you. So thank you, and we will definitely be bringing this back to the board. I can say that. Thank you, then.
Thank you.
Now on the agenda, we've got our next item, which is something which I think has a great amount of reference to the last item, which is really good. And I think we'd like to bring in Clive. I notice Clive is here with us now, and it's going to take us through the report that we've got our packs here and answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Board, for having me come and present today. I haven't got any slides. I really just want to say a few things by way of introduction, and then obviously take any questions or comments from the board. So hopefully that will be an acceptable way forward. My name's Clive Clark. I'm currently the Director of Inclusion for NHSI, NHSE, NHS England, NHS and I also chair the impact of COVID on the BAME communities group for Sheffield. So that's why I'm coming to present today. And the papers that you'll have seen in front of you are papers that have been produced by that group, sitting under the auspices of the Accountable Care Partnership. So very much a response. As you've said, Chair, this is a very good segue from the last item into this item. And in fact, the last item makes a number of references to involvement of communities and the impact of COVID on BAME communities. And I'll pick some of those up. I'll highlight some of those as I go along. But clearly, a term of reference I know the board has looked at in previous meetings has been the outcome of the Fenton report with its 7 recommendations in regards to the impacts of COVID and BAME communities, and the Marriott report 10 years on, and obviously updated, and the impact that has. I've seen that from previous notes. The short version is that I see that this paper is here for 3 main reasons. Firstly, for noting, it's to note the response from Sheffield, from the Accountable Care Partnership, by way of recognising, both at a national and at a local level, that there is a disproportionate impact of BAME, of COVID, on BAME communities. And there's many reasons for that, including poverty, racism, health, etc. But that has now, through the Fenton report, been seen as an undisputable fact, and you see that from the figures. It's to give this board a level of assurance that the ACP, via its membership of the voluntary independent faith sector, the social services, health services, as well as nursing homes, etc., have responded with the community in such a way as to recognise there are issues and attempting to respond to those. And if I was to offer a strapline to this paper, it would be co-producing a response to COVID by Sheffield communities, because that's what we've done, and I'll come on to that in a bit. And then the third area will be comment, asking the board itself to comment on and help set a direction for this work going forward. And we're looking, I hope that the board can do that. As I said, and as been said earlier, COVID itself has really ravaged over the past 6 months. But there was a recognition by the ACP board, by in particular, the work that the ACP board administration under Mark Tuckett and people like Greg Fell identified with their colleagues and myself the need for us to establish a group that looked at the strategic direction of how we are going to manage this impact on BAME communities. Hence, the setting up of the strategy group, which has, as a part of its membership, representatives from all of the anchor organisations, as well as some from the voluntary organisations, who sit and are helping to steer and set the direction as far as how we can support Sheffield and its response. Two subgroups sit as part of the strategy group. The first one is the staffing group. And you might ask yourself, well, why a staffing group? Well, what was realised very early on with COVID was the impact on BAME staff, and the fact that BAME staff was seen as an at-risk group and needed to have additional protection, as well difficult assessment, protection and support. And this group, which comprises of chairs of BAME staff networks, staff side and facilitated by equality diversity leads, has been working on ensuring that BAME staff in all areas of health and social care have had risk assessments, and not only had risk assessments, that the risk assessments have been then acted upon, either by requiring protected clothing or removal from the environment where they've been working to ensure that they are safe. And that has been quite a positive work involving, as I've said, trade unions and BAME representatives. The second group is a communities group, and that's been chaired jointly by Sarah Hepworth from Public Health, as well as Shahida, who's a community representative. At the first meeting of that group, this shows the seriousness of it, but also it shows that the community wants to be engaged, is waiting to be engaged. We had 70 community representatives attend that first meeting. And they have been fundamental in drawing up the papers that you've seen today, and also in producing the proposals which will be going forward as a part of our response to COVID and the BAME communities. We've submitted 2 papers to the ACP executive, both of which have been received well and have been endorsed. The first one at the end of July, the second one in August. What you will see attached to the papers that we brought, but also you'll see Appendix 2 is where we have matched across what we want to do as a city, a community, but also how it fits in with the recommendations from the Fenton report, the people plan, the workforce equality statements, etc. So that we've got a synergy of how we as a city are going to manage recommendations. We're not just going to leave those recommendations in the wind. We want to make sure that where recommendations work, where they work right for Sheffield, that Sheffield is responding to those. The last paper in August, 5 main themes came out of those, 3 of which we proposed, some of which have already been touched on. The first one was about improving data, and we've spoken about data, the lack of data, sometimes quite old data, and how we can use data to inform practice and inform behaviours, but also how we can use it as a benchmark and how we go forward. The second recommendation looked at how we could improve the uptake of flu jabs, flu vaccinations in BAME communities, and quite radical proposals being put forward on that, and how we can work with the voluntary independent faith sector in ensuring that we've got a dialogue with BAME communities, and we can support BAME communities where in things like myth busting, etc. We looked at something, we're looking at something about different ways of commissioning with BAME community and community groups, and how that can be done differently, more inclusive, co-production, working that way. And again, we're developing proposals for that. Cultural competence training came out loud and clear, and the need for organisations to reflect in their training programme cultural competence, supporting all staff, but also managers to understand and feel confident to be able to manage in a fair, compassionate way, and not feel like things have to be escalated to such a point that they get to a very serious point before they're responded to. And then the final one, I thought when this came to the ACP board was really positive, was the need to have a community voice or community voices at the ACP executive delivery and other senior groups within the ACP. The ACP wanting to hear from the community what their feeling and issues are. What we've done since the last meeting in August is Brian Hughes, who sits on this board, is the executive lead from an ACP perspective. We've written out, and Brian's written out to all the chief execs and exec officers, asking for their assurance that they accept what the paper has said, but also what their plans are for how they're going to implement it. And our plans are that we're going to go back to the ACP board in the next 4 to 6 weeks with firmer proposals on how the support we need to go forward with some of these areas. Again, supporting the community and the community generating those ideas. I won't talk any further, Chair. I'll stop there and take any questions, comments, observations, or Brian might want to come in at this stage.
Yeah, thanks, Clive. I mean, we can take questions for you now if that's good, but I know we've also got Sarah Hepworth, Shahida Sadiq here, and also Brian might want to contribute. If anyone else wants to contribute first, if we do that, and then we take questions that might go across. So if anyone else here that wants to contribute on the report, please do say so. And then once that's done, we will then move to questions. Please just raise your hand or just speak. If people think that Clive has covered what's needed, then I will then move to questions, and then if there's anything further that any of the people, those involved here involved in the report want to say, then you can do so later.
Chair,
Greg, do you want to say something?
Shahida and Sarah have a brief presentation, I think, for us. I think I'm right in that, Sarah, Shahida. So it may be good to just let them loose for.
Well, let's take that now then. Sorry, that's
okay.
what I was. Yeah, let's take that now then. Yes, please.
Sorry. Yeah, do you want that now? Okay. There'll be a slight overlap with some of what Clive covered, so we'll skim a couple of slides.
Yeah, able to share your screen, Sarah?
Can everybody see that okay? Is everyone able to see, yeah?
Yep.
Okay, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Sarah Hepworth, Health Improvement Principal, and I work as part of, in public health as part of Greg's team. Shahida?
Yes, good afternoon, Chair and Board. My name is Shahida Sadiq. I'm the CEO of Faith Star, but I'm also the city-wide BAME lead, as endorsed by all BAME communities in Sheffield, and I'm also the city's lead for faith communities, as endorsed by the faith leaders and faith communities as well, and co-chair the BAME and Public Health Inequalities Group with Sarah. Yeah. So getting straight into the presentation, Board, just to kind of set the scene a little bit, going back to the start of the pandemic, early March, April and May, there was clearly very strong indications of disproportionate impact on BAME communities in the city, much higher rates of virus transmissions, death rates within BAME communities, and this was well before it became a national agenda item. So part of the reason why I've sort of found myself leading the BAME sector was there was many people within the BAME community who were seeing this at a sort of community grassroots level, raising a lot of concerns, and felt really disconnected from the city in its response to COVID-19 and the response that we needed to give to BAME communities. And this was quite evident in the significantly higher volumes of, for example, Muslim burials. The whole of that was then compounded by the fact that pretty much every single institution in this city, from the public, the private and the VCF sector, came to us to say, actually, who do we need to be connecting to and how do we need to be connecting to within our BAME and faith communities and how do we access them? And time was of the essence, community engagement and networks were of the essence, but what became apparent very, very quickly was that there was a huge gap in information and contacts and networks, and the assumptions that a lot of institutions had about being connected into BAME communities didn't really exist. So that was an issue, and this was raised, and the work that we've done since has been a response to really that lack of connection with BAME communities in our city. Sarah?
So we had the National Fenton report and also, sorry, well, they were both by Fenton actually. So the Public England reports. This was basically because we didn't have ethnicity data on death certificates. So we had to do the investigations at a national level to understand the impacts on BAME communities. So we don't have that information at a national local level. So this was commissioned by the CMO. And we know now what that actually told us was that the disproportionate impacts on BAME communities were in fact playing out, and the risk was 4 times higher for BAME communities, and that varies by BAME group, and that also varies by gender. What the understanding impacts of COVID-19 report actually told us was that there was more information in terms of what the drivers were, and what we now understand are the structural inequalities, health inequalities, racism and discrimination. So we were tasked with, Clive's explained some of this already about how the group came about, the tactical group, and Shahida and I were asked to lead on the communities aspect of that, and I was asked to lead on the BAME impact assessment for the city. That was really difficult due to the lack of data. So we didn't have information on infection rates, severe disease, hospital admissions by ethnicity in the city, and we didn't have disease prevalence data there by ethnicity, and we didn't have health behaviour information by ethnicity. Some of this is held within our institutions, but it's not publicly available, or we have it on a geographical basis, or we have it at a practice level, but that's different to understanding it by ethnic groups. So the task was quite difficult, and it became really evident that it was very, very important for us to talk to our local communities about their lived experience. So this was where Shahida and I came in, and we set up a communities group with over 25 BAME organisations who attend, and we've listed them there, and we have representation from Black, African, Caribbean, Somali, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Chinese, Yemeni communities and Roman Slovak. And just to say, what did really appall me when I got into looking at the data, the Yemeni community and Roman Slovak community, it is so poor. The data in those 2 communities that we have is even worse than the other areas. We also have really good representation from the statutory and VCF sector on the group. We have representation from the CCG, the ACP, the Care Trust, Sheffield City Council, myself and Adele Robinson from Equalities, STH, SHC, VAS, Health Watch and CAB. So we only have 1 member from each of those services, because we wanted to allow the communities the space to talk about their lived experience. And many of these communities had not had contact with with the public sector for a very long time. So she's just going to talk us through the methodology.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So in terms of the methodology and the ethos of the group, what we wanted to implement was a process that enabled community organisations, particularly from BAME communities and BAME community individuals and representatives that came to the group, a space in which the power imbalance and structural inequalities wasn't about the public sector or any other institution speaking to them or at them, but a space in which we could implement some proactive inclusion. And what we mean by that proactive inclusion was we set a methodology that's embedded something called listen, learn, reflect and act. And the purpose of that was really that anybody who was non-BAME in that group would do exactly that: listen, learn, reflect and act. We embedded and underpinned all of that work with an action log, which was very, very much about you said, we did to the group. And very early on, one of the things that the group said to us is that we don't hear from the leadership, we don't hear from decision makers, we don't understand how we connect to the systems in the city. So one of the things that we did is we got guest speakers, so people like Brian and Clive and others, and people like John McElraith and Greg and others have attended that meeting. A whole range of different leaders. Response has been quite phenomenal in terms of the way that communities felt valued and heard, but more importantly, seeing the impact that that had on the leadership, because by listening to that lived experience, by people sharing the kind of structural inequalities and discrimination and barriers that they faced, but knowing that that was in a really, really safe space, it enabled an open and honest and transparent dialogue. And bearing in mind that some of these organisations, some of these communities had become disconnected from our institutions for at least a decade, if not more, we were kind of working in a context where the trust levels were huge, distrust levels were huge. We were talking, you know, how do we overcome 15 years worth of mistrust in a pandemic to try and work with these communities to get to some of the most vulnerable and have the greatest impact. So we were trying to almost cram in years and years worth of work into a matter of weeks and days, if not hours.
Sorry, this slide is very busy. There's a lot to say. So the structural inequalities that we've seen play out in the national papers from Public Health England were true for Sheffield. So we knew that our BAME communities lived in the most deprived parts of the city, that they were more likely to live in multiple occupancy, multi-generational housing, that there were inequalities in health conditions, they were more likely to have health conditions. There were inequalities in the prevalence of health behaviours also. Occupational risk, they were more likely to be in roles where they were taxi drivers, social care chefs, more likely to be in self-employment, and also, so they were either in roles where they were more likely to be shut down and economically impacted, or roles where they were more likely to have more exposure early on in the virus before we were into lockdown. And there was historic racism, discrimination, stigma, structural inequalities, lack of power and lack of voice that were constant themes throughout our conversations with the BAME communities. They told us that they were more likely to use public transport to travel to work. They were less likely to seek healthcare, lack of trust in the NHS to meet their needs due to lack of representation, lack of cultural appropriateness, late presentation, and we heard about people who had heart attacks because they weren't accessing care when they needed it. Unpacking all of these contributions is actually very challenging because they're all interconnected, they don't act independently, and obviously increase the risk of exposure to the virus and also severe disease and death. But the thing, sorry, I missed out there, which I know we all know, but I think it's important just to reiterate that on a geographical level, we know that these communities have been hit harder by COVID and suffered some of the highest death rates in the country. In terms of some of the key impacts, comms and communication and misinformation came out at the very start in our very first meeting really profoundly. And some of the things that we were hearing were very, very worrying. Misinformation, looking to friends, looking to social media, looking to country of origin, rather than trusted sources of information. Lack of trust with the government, the NHS, and this was particularly linked to the Black Lives Matters. The Fenton reports, as we know, the second report was delayed. There was lots and lots in the media, and people really felt that they couldn't trust the people that they should be trusting because they didn't feel that they cared about them. Language barriers were really important as well, health literacy in terms of reading. Interpreting issues, there was very little information in different languages in early stages of the epidemic as well. Hoax rumours, and some of this is still apparent now, we haven't bottomed some of these rumours, but BAME communities being used as guinea pigs for vaccination research was really something that people were frightened of. BAME people going to hospital for treatment for any condition, people believed that they would go in and be injected with COVID and that they wouldn't come out. If you go into hospital, you won't come home again. White people will be given preferential treatment for oxygen supplies. And COVID-19, as of the last few days, this has come out quite a lot. It just doesn't exist. It's a way to control BAME communities and impact on their lives more. Communities told us that people were frightened to attend appointments, as I mentioned earlier, whether that be in hospital or within primary care. And I mentioned earlier about heart attacks. Shahida.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did in the BAME Public Health and Inequalities meeting is we asked the communities themselves what the agenda was for each meeting. So we set an agenda 2 or 3 meetings in advance. And that was really important because it enabled the communities to kind of push to the top of their priorities what mattered for them at that particular time. And so just, you know, mental health was a key issue for older people and younger people, anxiety, complex, really multifactorial, you know, they were all sort of cross-cutting, relating to isolation, whether or not, you know, there was culturally appropriate and religiously appropriate practices, accessing the appropriate mental health support and services. Depression was at its height. We had a lot of feedback from people that were talking about their communities presenting in different ways. So, for example, we had a lot, for example, in the Bangladeshi community, where the rise in depression and attempted suicide has gone up. Similarly, an increase in male depression, particularly around people who, you know, loss of jobs, and because they're in sort of really precarious jobs, cash in hand or 0-hour contracts, or in frontline high risk employment that Sarah talked about earlier, that was really adding to the pressure and mental anxiety that BAME communities were going through, particularly because of the uncertain times that people were in. A really compounding issue was around isolation. BAME communities use social interaction to share information, share knowledge, keep connected to each other. And so suddenly finding themselves in isolation, whether they were shielding or because whether it was during lockdown, a lot of people lost their kind of information highway, which was, you know, verbally, you know, you meet somebody in the street or in the cafe or in your, you know, your place of worship. If you're worried about something or you want to chat about something, you would do it verbally. So there was a lot of oral information, and those relationships and links had a really negative effect on communities. The other thing that came out quite strongly was accessing frontline care and access. So people were unsure about whether or not they should, could or must in lockdown, and this notion that because it's COVID, everything else has stopped in the NHS. So there was a lot of hidden underlying conditions that people should have been kept getting checked for, but we were kind of thinking, oh, this isn't COVID related, so I mustn't go. The issue around food parcels and food security, as only 5% of BAME people access the Sheffield City Council food provision, but we did have to kind of raise the issue, hold on, are we even, and this goes back to the point of data, are we even collating this information? So when we're doing our emergency and community support services, how are we tracking ethnicity? So that was quite an important thing that we needed to do. However, the flip side of that was the response from communities themselves stepping up for communities was absolutely massive. They did not wait for institutions in this city. What they said was, hold on, there are immediate needs in our communities. We need to do something. So I know that hot and cold food from right across all the communities, whether it was setting up food banks, whether it was physically doing projects. For example, I think we're the only city in the country that provided during Ramadan food boxes for frontline workers in the city. Getting food boxes particularly to older generation was quite key. And then the other thing that came out of that was that because of those family and community networks, it wasn't just food parcels, it was that kind of then extended to prescriptions, medicines, any other type of interaction that they might need. The community stepped up in the most unbelievable way. Can you go into the next slide, Sarah? And because we'd let them set the agenda, there were a lot of cross-cutting themes that came out. So education was a key one. There was a significant worries around children falling behind, access to technology. So some families might only have a single laptop. How do we then, what happens if kids, particularly when they were during lockdown, that kind of digital poverty, how do we ensure that these particular children don't fall behind, and the complexities of online learning and all of that. So that was a key thing. Poverty and employment and loss of jobs. That was a massive issue, and there was quite a big discussion about that. Bereavement, again, in the BAME communities, like most communities, but particularly with bereavement, the way in which bereavement is done is not just the immediate family going to the funeral, it's the whole community coming together around the death of a person and the support of that family. And so those traditional methods of the whole of that community, it didn't matter which community it was in the BAME communities, but if somebody passes away, everybody comes together to support the family, and that wasn't able to happen. People weren't able to do condolences, people weren't able to do the usual, don't worry, we've got you back for the next 6 months while you're, you know, going through a grieving process, etc. So that was a massive impact, and we know that that's creating a bottleneck of pent up grief and potential mental trauma that we know we're going to have to pick up later down the line. And the issues of domestic abuse, we know that there's been a higher rate of contact with BAME organisations such as Roshni, Asiana and others, where the demand has outstripped the capacity that they've had. Sarah, next slide. But that's also happened in a context of huge demand where we've not really had capacity from BAME community organisations. And to put that into context for you, In 2020, there are only 24 BAME recognised organisations in the city, across the city. In 2014, when we used to have the BME network, and that was closed in 2014, there were 60 plus BAME community organisations. So you can see that within 6 years, we've lost 50% of that sector. The impact of that is that the existing organisations are completely overstretched, completely under-resourced, and the demand for their support and services over the last 6 months, and particularly in the lead into the lockdown, has been absolutely far outstripped what they could do. So there's been the impact of austerity on BAME community services. I can also say that it is a bit of a sad indictment of our city that most of the BAME community services and organisations have only survived in this city due to national funding. They have not survived in this city due to local funding. As far as I'm aware, I don't think there's a single BAME organisation in the city that has received in excess of £30,000 a year. So I'm not saying that they haven't received funds, they have, but the amount that they have received would not realistically be enough to have enabled them to survive. We've had a huge amount of lack of investment in infrastructure and capacity building, so that really a lot of those organisations, to be in a position to really step up to meet demand of some of our most vulnerable communities, they've not really had the structures or the means to do that. We got a lot of feedback from the BAME VCF sector, who have felt neglected, unvoiced, and they felt that the anchor VCF organisations in the city haven't really represented them, haven't reached out in a way in which they can kind of share their concerns and worries, and they felt impacted by an unequal access to funding. Again, the relationships across the sector have become disconnected, and that's not helped when the pandemic hit. So the demand for support and services from communities, as I said, is far exceeded what they've been able to deliver. But the caveat to that, and I have to say I'm really, really proud, and I know that others are, Clive, Sarah and everybody else, the way in which the BAME communities and BAME community organisations stepped up for the city during this pandemic has been absolutely phenomenal and really, really humbling. Sarah?
I'm going to give you the good news after we've just depressed you. So the really good news is the last 3 months and the work that we've done with the BAME group is we've developed trust, and the community organisations themselves, the quotes on this slide are showing you the trust that's been developed. They really value the space and the platform of the group. They've felt that it's been a really important space to have difficult conversations. The collaborative and participatory approach has been excellent. They feel that the reflective approach has been really important, and that it has also been a good practice model in order for us to move forward. And in developing that trust, what's really been important is the model, so that people could feel heard and being proactive. You know, we've had many reports, we've got many reports, many strategies within the city, but they were very clear that they wanted action. So in terms of our so some of the issues you've covered really with Eleanor in your discussion earlier. So our recommendations really and our asks for the discussion are probably more granular, but I will just briefly go through them and kind of summarise what the key asks are for us moving forward. It's to really note the good work and best practice model and findings from the COVID-19 health impact assessment and also the outcomes from the community group. It's to continue to commit to working with BAME organisations and continue to build and develop on the trust. We have now the Fenton recommendations, which the Health and Wellbeing Board have endorsed, as Clive mentioned earlier, and we also have the ACP recommendations, which reflect the Kevin Fenton. We're coming up with more recommendations, so there is a job of work to do to marry these all together and to think about where they sit. Is it that that will all sit under the ACP? And as Eleanor mentioned earlier, we've got the population questionnaire. When that comes out, we will also have more information that we can share, because these documents will continue to be iterative. So there is a real job of work around where these should sit within the city. Data is really problematic in terms of a lot of it we have by geography or GP practice, as I mentioned earlier. We really need data by ethnicity as a city across social, health and economic and environmental factors, and particularly around disease prevalence and health behaviours. And we need to take action to reduce those inequalities across the city, which we have known about for many years. Empowering and involving BAME voices in all the services and interventions, policies and communications that we develop, and supporting the capacity building of the community, ensuring the NHS and council services are representative. So there is overlap between what we found within the impact assessment and the work that we've done already. So what we wanted really to discuss with you today was how to continue to take this work forward in the recommendations, and it builds on the conversations that we had earlier. And that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm sure that will have raised a lot of thoughts. As with previous presentations, I might ask if possible to return to your slide with your final slide a little later. But I know Brian either wants to contribute my questions. I'll bring Brian in first.
Thank you. I just want to sort of bring a little bit of that back to what was said in the previous conversation with Eleanor, and I'm going to use this in a constructive way, so please don't take it, Sarah or Shahida or anybody. There's a rawness to what we've got in terms of that intelligence that we've built through the last 6 months, that some of it we already knew, most of it we already knew, but the way it's been laid out and the conversations and the privilege that I've had in terms of joining some of those groups. So when you call me as a guest speaker, I'm not. I feel a guest being welcomed into it, but how do we listen and how do we learn and how do we really take some of what we already knew and some of what we've learned through this experience and through difficult experience, but actually embed and ingrain it in the way that we work. So there's back to that rawness, but the power and so much information, a bit like where Eleanor was a half an hour ago, going, there's almost too much. How do we distill it? And how do we work together as organizations and as communities to sort of think, what is it we need to do? And you've heard me say this before, it's about, and educate me and help me. And as the organization that I represent, sort of really learn from that. And that's why when the opportunity came up, when we knew that Clive had his new opportunity in NHS England and improvement, it was very easy for me to put my hand up to sort of say, I will help you lead this agenda. And I think we as a Health and Wellbeing Board have so much that we can contribute into this space as well. So thank you to all three for how articulately you've explained what I've heard through the last 6 months as well. I'm privileged to hear.
Right, thank you for that, Brian. Greg is signalling, I know. Greg.
Thanks. All three of you, hugely helpful, hugely powerful. I've heard some of that, but not all of that before. I was scribbling a few words as you taught, the trust and the building of trust within a community that had lost trust in institutions. I think we'll grab onto that with both hands and keep developing it. Power, the distribution of power, easy to say we shift power, hard to do, but we commit to that in whatever way, shape and form. The specific recommendations that you made, and there were a lot of them, I did clock that. I'd kind of take those as read. We will get on with that in various shapes, shapes and guises. Worry points I have, sorry, the other really positive point is the methodology that particularly Sarah and Shahida about. That was just brilliant. You can apply that methodology to all sorts of other tricky things in various shapes and guises, and there's a lot to learn from that. Two worries, structure to take some of that forward. There will be effort needed from lots of us. Now, don't just mean in this context, Clive, Shahida and Sarah. I mean, a lot of people, the structure to keep eye on the ball, because we'll all get busy with other stuff. That does worry me. We do need to not forget that. And last, it's not really a worry, just an observation. You've told us a hugely powerful story about Black and minority ethnic communities. You could say the same about any of the other groups that basically have the rum end of the deal. So those with a disability, those with a severe mental illness, you could go on for a long time there. So whilst this is important, no doubt about that in this context, there are a lot of other things that you could tell an equally powerful story about. So we should just not forget that.
Can I just
we were both on it there. Please do.
I was just going to say, Greg, probably going to, you go.
Sorry. I was just going to say, Greg, yeah, I think taking an intersectional approach across all the protected characteristics is really important. And that's one of the things that came out from the BAME and public health meeting, that really, really strongly, you know, people are tired of being othered. You know, we're not just pigeonhole stickers in BAME or stickers in disability or LGBT or women or anything else. One of the things that people have really said quite strongly that came out in the BAME public health meeting is we are citizens of Sheffield, and we have a whole myriad of needs, and it's about placing the citizens at the heart and responding to those needs. And that came out really, really strongly from those groups, that, you know, please don't pigeonhole us. We have many identities and we're rooted across many different protected characteristics. It all needs supporting. So just to reiterate your point, Greg, thank you. Sorry, Sarah, go on.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. Shows how much on the same page we are. Certainly disability came up, and I know Adele Robinson is looking at trying to replicate that. And E&D leads across the city are really concerned that all the characteristics are looked at.
Thank you, Judy.
I really appreciate that last point about the links between all those issues of inequality. Just a broader point, if you've been around a while, questions about BAME, health inequality are sadly not new at all. They come through a different lens, which happens to be COVID. So I think I've got a question to us all, which is, what are we going to do? We've known all this stuff for years and years. What are we going to do in this that is different and will make a difference? And I draw a parallel, and I think it's a challenge to services and systems. Health Watch has been doing a piece of work with deaf people who need interpreters. They're organised in a group for their own voice. They're a relatively tiny group. BAME populations are 20% of this community. Deaf people who need interpreters are tiny. We cannot get the changes that we think are needed, that they want. They're relatively small. We've done workshops, we've done everything that are in your very good recommendations. It hasn't changed. So my challenge is, if we can't change that little bit, how on earth are we going to change those really big practical and structural issues? And I don't have an answer to that, but it seems to me we really need to think harder about how it's done differently.
Thank you, Judy. Shahida, Shahida, do you want to respond there?
Yeah, one of the things I would say is about, and I used this term earlier on, about proactive inclusiveness. And what I mean by that is, you know, if you look at BAME communities in Sheffield, yes, they are nearly 20% of the community and they're intergenerational. The sad thing is, as a city, if we genuinely want to do something different, we need to look at the way we develop policy and strategy for our communities. We need to do that bit differently. And what I mean by that is that, as an example, you know, we have done no community engagement, we have done no community voice in a way that, for example, does not, let me just go back a step. We need to stop developing policy for the great grandparents and people who came through the Windrush generation and apply it to their great grandchildren, because their children are citizens of Sheffield. They don't know anything else. So one, I think it's cultural competencies. It's a better understanding of the reality of the lived experiences of our communities. And if we want to do it differently, genuinely kind of make forward steps in this, is about recognizing that some of our systems and some of our processes just inherently exclude some of those voices. And it's not because anybody's trying to be horrible or purposely doing that. It's the way the systems and structures are set up. And I think it's about us as a city empowering some of those voices in a different way. And that might mean doing the methodology that we've done. That might be going, actually, you know, I might be the person or the position, have the position of power, but if I really want to affect change, I might need to just, you know, squish my seat up a little bit and create a bit of space for somebody else to share that power with me, have that shared voice and shared space, which is a different way of working, and it's risky and it is, you know, challenging and can be quite provocative. But I don't think we can shy away from it or be afraid of it. I think we've just got to try and do something different.
Thanks, Shahid. Clive, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just a small point. I think if we don't do it now with what we know and what we've seen, with the health inequalities that have been shown by COVID, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with okay, accepting that a second spike is with us, then I think we will never do it. There'll never be a momentum as it is now. And it's about all of us taking on board now that momentum, like Shahid has said, using a methodology that listens and really coming up with solutions about this and being action orientated rather than policy, let's get another policy driven or written or whatever else. So I think there's a hunger, there's a thirst. There's certainly from the communities, and you've heard from Shahid and Sarah, there are people out there. We mustn't miss this opportunity. That's what I would say.
Thanks. Sarah, do you want to say something briefly?
Just really briefly, in our group, there's 25 leaders. It's not just representations from communities. They're actually leading. We just didn't know that they were leading. I think that's the thing that really struck me, is the leadership development isn't needed by those communities. They're already doing that. They're already leaders in their own right. So I just think it was us recognising that and allowing them to have their platform. They're already leading in their own spaces. And it was just about connecting back up together. Not to say that there isn't a need for that in some of the smaller community organisations, but certainly with the 5 big anchor organisations, they're already leading the way. We're catching up, really.
Thanks. So I've got 3 questions from Mike, Terry, and Catherine. I'll take those in, but anyone else that wants to ask a question, please signal soon. But before I close the list, that's okay. So Mike.
Oh, you're on mute, Mike.
Just once. Yeah. There we go.
This is obviously my first meeting, so I'm sitting listening with interest, and there's some really powerful information that's come out of both of those reports. And as people have said, a lot of this is raw, but it's very good to see that rawness. But we need to somehow try and distill it and make it into, more understandable and distill it into a more structured format. Obviously, COVID has allowed us to deliver as a set of partners very rapidly. We've delivered stuff, as I think we've heard, very quickly, things that we might have been talking about for ages. So for me, it's how do we hang on to that? How can we continue to deliver those things? And what are they? For me, it's about linking into existing structures, because we've got the JSNA, and that's a really powerful source of information. Greg's already said, this needs to be updated on an ongoing basis. And if we use that as the basis of developing our policy and how we respond to things, then I think that's got to be a good way forward. But I think we've also got to link into things like the ACP. How is the ACP and what is the ACP going to take on board in terms of delivering some of this? But the thing that just kind of worries me in all of these, and we've done it time and time again, year after year, we get a set of recommendations. We say that, yes, we want to give a commitment to that. We want to go away and we want to signal we're going to deliver. But actually, we haven't made any assessment of our capacity and capability and the resources that might be needed to actually deliver those things. And I think, we need to do that, and that's a sizable chunk of work. But then we need an honest conversation with people about what we can do and what we can't do, because we then are just discredited if we say we're going to do everything and then nothing happens. So it's, I'm behind everything that's been said this afternoon, apart from we somehow need to get a structure, we need to dovetail it into our existing framework for working together, and we need an open and honest conversation about what we can and can't do.
Thanks, Mike. Shahida, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, the feedback that we've had from communities is absolutely that, Mike. We are tired of recommendations. So as an example, in the Fairness Commission, there was over 50 recommendations made in the Fairness Commission 10 years ago, and we haven't measured the impact of that on BAME communities. Similarly, with the Lamay report, the Theresa May report, there's been national recommendations, regional and local recommendations made over the last 10 years. What we haven't done is measured the impact or effectiveness or demonstrable action against any of those recommendations in the city. And I think if we're serious about, like Clive was saying, we've got a once in a lifetime opportunity to do something different. And one of the ways in which we've done that in the BAME Public Health meeting is demonstrable action, which is by creating an action log that says, you said, we did. And on the point of being honest and transparent with people, we have had really difficult conversations where we have had to say to people, you know, that's great that you want that, but actually under the current circumstances within these difficult structures, that is just not going to be able to happen because resources are finite, we're cutting across the city, and people have really welcomed that. Once you've just stated the facts, had been really honest and said, this is the situation, this is what we've got to work with, what can you do? They've absolutely stepped up to the mark on that. I think the biggest feedback we've had on that is where people have felt aggrieved because that we haven't had that honest conversation with them, we haven't set the scene for them, we haven't given them the facts and figures, and yet we're just kind of assuming that they should know it all. So I totally agree with what you're saying, Mike, that if we're going to do this and kind of link it into existing structures, it's about measuring our effectiveness in trying to work towards some of those recommendations.
And those communities can help us, I think, prioritise where, you know, if we go back and have that honest conversation and say, look, we can't do everything. People are, in my experience, realistic. And we say, look, help us prioritise what we should do. This is the resource that's available. That's what you're saying we should be doing. Let's work together in terms of prioritising what we do first and what we might do at a later date.
They're absolutely calling for that, Mike. They really are.
Well, then the challenge for us is, how do we do it? You know,
we do need to move on to Terry's question. I'm sorry, we're quite short on time for this item now. Terry, please.
So I'll keep this brief. Thank you, George. I just want to come back to recommendations. Unlike some of the nuances in the last paper, I'm fully supportive of all of them, so I won't go into any detail there. However, there are a few bits of the recommendations where I think we might need to just be a slight bit more ambitious around them. You know, people have picked up, Judy's picked up, you know, we've had all of this data for years. And one of the things I think we need to be really clear about is, yes, we commit to collecting data, but we need to use that data to inform what we do. And we simply don't treat that as another tick box exercise in, you know, collecting diversity data and so on. So we absolutely, as a system, must commit that data means something. And the thing I've got to just feed back here with Sarah and Shahida's presentation was the methodology you used actually brought that data to life. It wasn't just a set of facts and figures, and as Clive and Mike have alluded to, you know, you've got that raw data there, you know, rawness of actually what does this really mean to somebody who is living through that. So I'd like to possibly see more of this so that we can translate that data into something tangible in terms of how we take actions forward. The second point is just around cultural competence. I think it's really important. I think we can only be culturally competent if we co-produce. And part of that co-production, just picking up on Shahida's point there, is about a realistic and honest conversation about what the co-production may or may not lead to. So again, I think we should be endorsing that approach. And then the really powerful thing, Shahida, you said there was about creating that shared voice and shared space. You know, it isn't about tokenism of, you know, bringing somebody from a community just to have a discussion. It is really about us nudging up and sharing a seat with an individual or a community representative. And I think there's some lessons there for us as individual organisation and as a health and wellbeing board about connecting that leadership into some of the discussions. And I think we might touch on that in the next agenda item. So thank you very much for all the hard work. It's been.
Thanks, Terry. I think some of that probably, I mean, you can respond now if you want, but it also might just respond just after Catherine as well when just concluding. If I just bring Catherine in now, we'll respond to Terry and Catherine in a second again. Catherine?
Yeah, a couple of really quick points. I'm here really representing Mark, and he left me a couple of notes that he just wanted to make the group aware of. One was to say that the ACP did put a response into NHS England about health inequalities. They identified 8 urgent actions, and we put a holding response in. So I think there's a lot more work we can do on that, but we absolutely support that. And if the board are interested, we're happy to share
that holding response that we sent in. The second one was around representation on different boards and committees, including this one, from different communities, but I think that's probably going to get picked up, Dan, under the terms of reference anyway, so I'll leave that one there.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I think we would obviously really like to see any submission. And secondly, I think you're right that whilst it's clearly really relevant to this item, that hopefully will be picked up under that topic. So thanks. So I mean, if we can maybe see the recommendations again, if that's okay, on the slide. There we go. Just coming up now. I think. It's another one of those where, as Terry has said, it's more able to more firmly hopefully endorse some of this. However, I do understand that there's obviously quite a lot of stuff here, and well, I'm happy to take any thoughts from board members how to proceed. I mean, I'm relatively confident, having looked at these, can be that we can, to a large extent, endorse these. But I'd like to take any comments from anyone that wants about how we can best support and be active rather than passive in our engagement with these. Does anyone want to comment particularly specifically on the recommendations? And I appreciate that that Terry, you've already treated to some of this stuff. So am I seeing anyone that wants to comment particularly on this? If no one does particularly, I would suggest that clearly overall, not just for this, but for what Clive's presented as well, we want to endorse the work we've done. I think, again, a little bit like the last item, it is been an incredible amount of work, and in this case, I'm particularly impressed by the breadth of engagement that has come. I think who said it. I think the fact is that you can go down numbers, can't you, quite a lot, and actually this is engaged in a much different way, which is really powerful. However, from our point of view, it has to go somewhere to mean something, doesn't it? And we can hear voices which I'm not denying has a power in itself, but we need to make sure that we can get this. So I think clearly we need to find a way of, as a board, bringing. I want to find a way of not saying let's bring this back, because it's not about bringing this back. It's about moving this forward, isn't it? So I hope that I hope the board is willing to agree to endorse what we've heard today, and endorse what we see in front of us, and commit to doing everything we can to do that. Is everyone happy with that? But to give massive thanks to everyone we've heard from today, because we've heard an awful lot, and this represents a massive amount of work on what I would say personally is one of the most burning issues of our time, and I also think we're really lucky to have people in the city who are really qualified and to talk about this and to help us move forward in it, and we need to seize the opportunity. So thank you all. We will consider the best way to move forward with this. It's been a good discussion. What I want to know, I realise we've got a few more items. I just want to take a very, very brief break if we can. I realise we've got I think three more items. I just really want to. I want to keep to a very, very hard 5 minutes if we can. So according to my clock at 5:16, I do want to restart the farm through items, and I know it's been quite a marathon session already. And so thanks for your contribution. So I'll see you all at 5:16. Thank you. So if anything needs to be done, either turn off the equipment, but there we go. I assume we're all go. Welcome to Jenny Milner, who is hopefully known to most people, to take us through the a regular item, I guess, in terms of in the long-term structure of the Better Care Fund. But it's also worth noting that this the board delegates the sign-off of this, which is a statutory function of the board, to the chairs. Obviously, that can be reviewed in future, but that's the current situation. But it's obviously important that Jenny keeps us abreast of where we are with this. Thank you, Jenny.
Yep. So I'm Jenny Milner, Better Care Fund lead for Sheffield City Council and the CCG. It's nice to see Mike Potts back.
Hi.
Hiya. So this, I'm going to take you back in time, back to March 2020, back to a period before COVID. This is the end of year submission. So this relates to the March 2019, April 2019 to March 2020. So it's that year. And it's the end of year submission. So it's the plan that we submitted for the Better Care Fund. Just to remind everyone, the Better Care Fund is the national programme that requires a local authority and the CCG to pool budgets in order to support the integration of care. In Sheffield, our Better Care Fund goes beyond the minimum contribution, and our programmes are extended to include other areas of work for joint decision making. To summarise what the priorities were for 2019 and 2020, they will be refreshed for 2020, 2021, but I'm not here today to tell you next year's, I'm just here to conclude the previous year. So for 2019, 2020, the structure was urgent care. We were looking at blended contract arrangements, supporting improvements to avoid hospital admission, keeping people keeping well, expanding the service offer to ensure that we minimise the ill health and maximise the independence of people, active support and recovery, care out of hospital services, really further making sure that we offer the good intermediate care service, that we develop the discharge home to assess, and that we sustained our reduced detox position. Ongoing care covers all of the services that people get in the longer terms, continuing health care, residential care, long-term packages of care. Mental health, we wanted to improve access to support was the priority of the Better Care Fund. Independent living, the equipment contract and the services that live within it. And we're also responsible for the capital investment, which is the Disabled Facilities Grant. So we had a plan for 2019-20. The ambitions were to ensure that service users had a seamless service, that care was integrated across provision, basically to hide the wiring and make sure you got a service wherever you needed it and you didn't need to worry about who was funding it. We wanted to make sure we were more efficient, that we removed duplication in our services, and we wanted to be able to redesign the health and social care system to reduce reliance on hospital care, and ensure that people could be kept out of hospital as much as possible in the community. And in the plan, as always, was then to deliver that efficiency and savings over the longer term so that we can invest in prevention. The next steps that we had then was that we would build on that with a joint commissioning committee, which we have done. And as we go into next year, we'll see that joint commissioning plan that we'll be able to bring at some point in the future to the Health and Wellbeing Board if they're interested in it. So the Better Care Fund plan, it has a minimum contribution of 74 million, is the statutory requirements that covers the 4 key indicators. But in Sheffield, our budget for that year was 399 million, because as I said, we include ongoing care and mental health, which make up the majority of that, the LD services and ongoing packages. We submitted that budget to the Health and Wellbeing Board back in June 2019 and it got approved, and the final plan got submitted in September. So we were operating, we were delivering the plan while submitting it, which is how it normally happens, but we were pretty confident that the plan would be accepted. The plan got approved in October, which was pretty good because we were mainly in the way of delivering it. Plans were delivered as expected, subject to amendments. Just in March, COVID was beginning to come in, but it didn't. So the budget as we set it, I said it was 398 million. I have realised only today, I've only given you the budget as it was set. So what I'll do is verbally tell you where we ended up, and then I'll make sure that as an amendment added to this record. So that was how it was originally broken down. When at the end of the year, position, we ended up with 397 million planned, and we ended up spending 400 million. The changes related to 2 million pressures from mental health, from extra activity that we weren't aware of. 0.8 million of that was complex ongoing care packages that we weren't cited on at the beginning of the year that came in, and it only takes a couple of really complex high cost packages to get the budget really high. That we weren't cited on, and some of the reduction in the planned spend is because we deferred some of the disabled facility grant expenditure into next year, so we've kept that in reserves for plans for next year, but we didn't spend it in this year. But we were able to account for all of the money, and the detailed plan can be shared with members if they'd like it. Our performance indicators, we have to report on the number of readmissions after an hospital discharge into hospital to see how successful reablement is, non-elective admissions, delayed transfers of care and residential admissions. I'm pleased to say our readmissions we achieved, I think I've got it summarised in the next slide, sorry. So non-elective admissions, as at the end of March, we were under target. We did hope to reduce it more than that, but we actually achieved what we wanted to, and we did all right with it. Some people who are very familiar with the data will see that from previous years, the target changed quite significantly because the way that it's measured nationally. But from our position, we delivered under target this year. In previous years, we've actually never achieved it, but that's because the way that we was measuring it in Sheffield, and we've had to rebase that because we've realised we were overly ambitious. In previous years, we'd aimed to deliver more than what we'd set out in the contract to deliver, so we were over ambitious, so we've just rebased it back now. So our target fits with what we intend to do, and we've actually achieved it. DTOC, we were able, again, this was a really ambitious target for us in Sheffield. At the end of March, successful in delivering that. We were 48% fewer than we were last year, which is a huge achievement. We've done a lot of work on the delayed transfers of care and pathways out of hospital, and we've been able to sustain a huge reduction compared to the previous year to where we were this year. We always knew it was a very ambitious target, but we've kept to it, and even during COVID and this year, we've maintained that target to date. Residential admissions, we failed to achieve that target. More people were admitted into permanent residential care than we had planned to. This was a consequence of January, really, where I had an influx of permanent residential admissions. However, we have reviewed every individual one of those, and it was necessary. We're pretty confident that it weren't a case of we admitted anybody that didn't need to be in permanent residential care at that time. It was just that we were probably ambitious in what we set out to do. And obviously now during COVID will have changed completely during this year. And the reablement measure, we were just slightly over by the end of the year, with just 1% more getting back into hospital. So our successes in 1920, the Joint Commissioning Committee has been established. We've done a lot of work in the shadow form, developing that committee and our priorities. Integrated workforce, the team around the person was the example we gave in the Better Care Fund submission, how we've come together in the local authority with health partners and GPs to wrap around individuals in communities to prevent admissions and to enable discharges smoothly. We can share the details of that if people are interested. The challenge going forward in 2020-21, interesting that we wrote this pre-COVID, because COVID would probably be a challenge now, but our challenges probably remain the same: good quality, sustainable care market that can meet demand. The fragility of the home care market became really apparent because of COVID pandemic. We're going to need to do a lot more work on that, and we are doing that during this year to make sure we've got a stable care home market. That's what we need, not just in the short term, but the medium and long term in Sheffield. And that where we do need to support providers, we are doing, but also to ensure that if that market needs to reduce, given the change in focus to keeping people home, and then we do that in a stable way. An integrated care records and sharing records across the system will be a challenge, even with COVID. Sharing information and technology will continue to be one of the enablers to great care, but also one of the challenges across the health social care voluntary sector footing. The purpose of it coming, as George said, we delegate the authority to the chairs to submit the final submission. We want to make sure the Health and Wellbeing Board members are cited on what we submitted, and it was just to give anybody any opportunity to ask any clarification questions, or for me to provide any information at a later date should you want more detail on any of the specific parts.
Thank you, Jenny. And I'm so sure I don't think anyone could possibly think of any challenges we might face in the 2021 year for that. Greg.
No challenge. Thank you for the work. It's always reassuring to know that it's done, well led, well executed. Certainly one less thing that's on my worry list. So thank you to, you, Jenny, but it's a team effort, so a lot of people have done that. Oh, only one observation. We've had this conversation before. A lot of the narrative was about under target, aka financials, and I'm not naive enough to know this isn't about the money, but it's the finances versus the outcomes, etc. So the targets are about the money, but what really matters is the outcome. So we've had that conversation before. We'll have that conversation again, but I'd encourage us all to reflect on it.
I reflected on that 10 minutes before I was doing the presentation. We talk about the KPIs and the finance, but we don't cover patient experience, and it maybe be helpful to make sure that. So I was thinking of the CQC LSR review, which criticised Sheffield quite heavily on its patient experience going through this system, and it would probably be timely to make sure we demonstrate that on that as well.
Thanks, Greg and Jenny. There any other questions, comments here? If no, okay, so thank you to Jenny. Oh, sorry, we got David. Sorry, I'm just, please, yes.
I was just thinking it might be a question more for the co-chairs or for the board in general. But do we see a situation where I'm a GP? Do we see a situation in the future where frontline health and social care staff don't have to ask the question: is this health or is this social? Is that plagues frontline sort of care staff, certainly from a health perspective, but I'd love that for that to be the case. I didn't know what people's thoughts were.
The thing is, I can answer that. To try and others may give a. I think that's probably a very broadly shared goal. Certainly a goal of mine, because absolutely, if whether you work in health or social care, we should all be caring, and it's all about health anyway. But I think what's been widely recognised about the care fund, and this is a national, not a local issue really, is that, but it is true locally, is that we've had great success in aligning budgets, and that has had, benefits for the system. But the reason, we're looking to go beyond that in terms of things like joint commissioning, but work through the Canal Care Partnership and and several other areas, is that very reason that we need deeper roots and deeper integration to be able to achieve that front-facing outcome, which I think for me is very desirable, which is that seamless integration of health and social care, which patients can see, or rather the patients can't see. And Terry might want to comment on that, amongst other things.
I don't disagree with that sentiment, George, and there will be several people sat around this virtual table that have perhaps slightly more long in the tooth than some of us. That has been a long-held belief that we need to head towards that deeper integration. I just want to reflect, actually, that the information we've seen is showing that we're on a journey towards that. We're nowhere near it yet, but we are on that journey. And to have the evidence that we're succeeding in that journey is really important. So yeah, I think, David, in an ideal world, and let's not ditch an ambition because it's an ideal world, that is absolutely where we should be headed. And just to pick up on Greg's point there, is actually, if we move away from just thinking about the KPIs and just thinking about the money, and we base our response and our planning in terms of how we integrate to the experience of people who live in Sheffield and who use these services, it actually might help us in our vision and our planning in making that a reality. Other than that, Jenny and team, thank you very much. And actually, just going beyond that, it's actually, this is testament to everybody that works in the health and social care system and our voluntary sector partners in actually meeting some of that true integration and being able to keep people well and keep them out of hospital. So thanks for bringing that information, Jenny, but thank you to our wider population, our wider care system.
Thanks, Terry. Can I bring Judy in?
Just a very quick comment. I agree with all that. I think it's an excellent report. I think thinking about the reports we had earlier, the importance of getting wider perspectives into that, who's in the party in terms of integration, I think is something we do need to think about in structurally in terms of that committee and the processes therein.
Thank you, Judy. Unless I see any other comments, I would just echo what Terry says. Thank Jenny and team, because yeah, there's a lot of good things about the Better Care Fund, but I also know that the very, very wise people at senior levels of the NHS do require quite a significant amount of compliance style activity, and I'm sure they're absolutely right in everything they want, but I know it takes a lot of work to do so, and I'm always grateful for the teams that do that. So thank you very much. Right. After that, we have got the paper for our terms of reference update, which is within our packs. I'm not quite sure who wants to say something further. Does Greg want to say something first?
Yeah, I'll do it quickly. We're all been here a long time, so I'll do so quickly. Dull but necessary and important. And thank you to Dan, who did most of the hard work on this in collaboration with the two co-chairs and a few others. So I have that on record because Dan does a lot of hard work behind the scenes. We do the terms of review reference once a year. This is a formal subcommittee of full council. Therefore, we do the job properly. We do the job by the book. The key things that turned up in this year's review, they're all documented in the paper. I'll take it as read. The key things to draw your attention to, yes, the board is focused on the strategy. That's taken as read. We had an interesting conversation about the holding to account point versus something about collective leadership. We are all responsible for implementing the thing called the health and wellbeing strategy, which, as you know, is broad and sprawling and cuts into all sorts of different spaces across all of the areas for which we're directly responsible or can influence indirectly in some way, shape or form. And again, I think that's taken as read, but that's subtly different from holding to account. And it might be worth dwelling on that briefly. Representativeness of the membership of the board was an interesting conversation. I think the reality is we're not as representative as we would like to be. We're not as diverse a group of people as we would like to be. So there's some points in the paper unpacking that. One of the key issues is avoiding tokenism in representation. I'd draw your attention to section 3.8. There's a set of specific recommendations in there. Personally, I think they're fairly self-explanatory. Key question is, do you agree with them or not? I'm presuming most probably will. 3.9, I'll draw your attention to, which is about ways of working. We've consistently for a while now been trying to move away from the sort of the model of the officer prepares a paper, presents a paper to the board, and the board says yes, to something much more discursive and much broader. And that's been successfully done in some of the conversations we've had, but not always, actually. So I do think that we need to collectively make a definitive effort to have a different way of working. And some of the methodology that Shahida Sadiq talked about earlier, I think was really, really interesting in some of that. So some useful and interesting learning. Membership was the third kind of main area of discussion. A few specific reflections. We don't have a strong set of voices representing children and young people as I think we would like. We should reflect on that. We should work out how we address that. And there's a recommendation that the two co-chairs just address that. So the key question is, do you trust them to do that? I think I probably all do. Housing. some of our specific, well, one of our themes within health and wellbeing strategy is housing. The membership of the board doesn't quite nail that for us. So I think we probably need to work out how we address that. Lastly, the CCG membership. The world has moved on and the CCG structures have changed, and what's in the terms of reference doesn't quite reflect how the CCG is structured. So some thoughts were given to that. Lastly, the size of the board. What we're trying to avoid is a health and wellbeing conference that gets organised once a month. So kind of trying to keep it reasonably tight. There's a slight there's an interesting debate to be had between the formal board meetings, which are once a quarter, though this is one of them, and then the strategy discussions, which is once a month. And we might choose, I think we should choose, I'd recommend we do, move to the strategy meetings, moving to a very different style of working, as I'd previously alluded to, and being hosted by the board as opposed to board meetings. The Health and Wellbeing Board still sponsors it, but it's hosted by a move to a different way of working for that one, and that allows us to bring in a much wider, much more diverse set of voices, views, interests, and influences, and making much greater use of lived experience, which we've already talked on already today. So nearly done. 4.4 of the paper are the specific recommendations to suggested changes of the terms of reference, and so if you agree with those specifics, they will become the terms of reference. They will be put through the council process and approved in the fullness of time. And lastly, 5 are basically the 3 broad sets of recommendations. One around the chairs, finding children and young persons voice to be a member of the board. Second recommendation is around an additional place for the voluntary and community sector to do a bit further rebalancing, and the third one is the dull but necessary, agreeing the changes to the terms of reference that DEM services will ultimately make and put to full council. So I'll pause for breath there.
Thank you, Greg. Do I have any comments or questions on that? If not, the paper sets out, as Greg has outlined, both a series of comments, but also a series of things to accept. Kerry.
So I support everything in the paper, and I ought to, given I've been involved in the conversations. I'm just picking up on page 11. Again, just with regards to CCG membership, we've got Director of Strategy, which isn't a role. So if we can amend that wording to an executive director representing the CCG, it picks up on the fact that we can invite somebody with responsibility for strategy who doesn't necessarily have that as the formal title. It's just a small amendment.
Okay, so I thought, yeah, that's slightly different to the wording that's proposed. I thought there was proposed wording around an appropriate. I thought appropriate director. But anyway, whatever the CCG is most comfortable with, I think it's a very small difference. But anyway, yeah, we agree we need to change that. That type of job role, certainly. Okay. Are there any other comments or questions? If not, can I see that we assent to the paper? Not seeing any too much reaction to that, so that's great. Thank you all, and thanks for the work. I know Dan's done a lot of work on that, so thanks particularly to Dan there, and also to Greg for taking us through it. Now we're just onto our last substantive item. We've got Lucy from Health Watch to give the verbal update. If we can bring Lucy into the meeting, please. Hi, Lucy. Sorry that it's a little later than you might have expected to be in today, but it's been a busy and productive meeting. So, yeah, welcome.
Thank you. That's okay. I'll try and keep it brief. I think everyone's probably wanting their tea right now. Thanks for taking a verbal report as well. I will say that the kind of information that I'm going to refer to is all also contained within written reports that are either already available on our website or are about to be published on our website. So I'm going to refer to the sort of headline news of what we've heard over the last sort of 3 months, or since the last time I was here at board in June. So during that time, we've done a survey that we had around 570 responses to, and that survey was done online, over the phone, as well as in paper form, sent out via food bank, food boxes. The information has also been gathered through groups that we've attended online, and also inquiries coming in through our information and advice line. So some of those themes that we've heard about really have already been well discussed and reflected elsewhere. So things like continuing confusion around messaging, for example, around masks, exemptions from mask wearing and so on, the impact on people's mental health. These things I think have been well discussed already. So I'm going to focus on some of the other things that maybe haven't been touched on quite so much. Dentists, it continues to be an ongoing major theme for us. We hear so much from people about dentists and their distress that they're experiencing when not being able to access the support they need. Now, obviously, that's changed through COVID. We've had a period of time where local dentists were shut, and then moving back into at least a partially open service. But it's still a major concern for people locally, and I think Healthwatch England have picked up on it as something that is actually a real sort of concern nationally, and every Healthwatch in the country is reporting a similar story. Just thinking about the sort of move to digital virtual consultations, just sort of worth saying that we are getting such a mixed sort of set of feedback about that. So for some people, clearly that's really working quite well, but for others not so. We had somebody respond to our survey that said, I don't have a computer and I cannot remember how to turn on the TV. No one seems to think that dementia sufferers might like a good old-fashioned letter from the GP. And I think we all know that there's going to be a mixed picture there, and we're all very mindful that actually the people that we've heard from most are those people that are probably most able to connect with those services in that way. Social care, there's been a lot of praise for frontline staff in social care. We've heard some really positive feedback and stories there. We have also heard a lot of confusion from people around sort of charging for services, particularly people with direct payments. Yeah, that's been a very sort of common query and theme coming through. We've also heard some really powerful stories around the restrictions on accompanying and visiting. So that's both social care settings, care homes, but also hospitals, and the restrictions around visiting in hospitals, which I guess it won't come as any surprise. And we've already touched on that as well today. So I think at the moment, the challenge for us at Healthwatch is kind of two-sided. I kind of see it as being two sides of the same coin of engagement. On the one hand, we know that there's a substantial number of people in the city that we still haven't heard from. So this was really brought home to me the other day when I was talking to staff at the Deaf Advice team. We were trying to set up a focus group with some deaf people to talk about their experiences during COVID. And the Deaf Advice team reflected that actually the people that normally came and dropped into their service, they had no way of contacting currently, and that was potentially up to around 50% of the people that normally use their service that they weren't in touch with. So that's a huge significant number, and if you think about the fact that that's probably reflected across different populations who are digitally excluded in for sort of various reasons, I think it just feels as though there's so much that we haven't heard in terms of people's experiences. And the flip side to that is that there are people that we're reaching, but actually people are feeling surveyed to death. So there's been an enormous call out for information through different routes over the last few months in relation to lots of different things. And there is a bit of survey fatigue out there, is one thing that we're picking up. We had a comment through one of our a bit of work we were doing, gathering sort of narrative stories around people's experiences of mental health services. And there was a quite powerful comment from one person that said, what do they do with all of these surveys anyway? We fill them in year after year and we never see any change. And I think that's a kind of wake-up call really in terms of thinking about how we're using the information that we're getting. And I would ask, that some sort of serious consideration is given really to using that enormous amount of information in the rapid health impact assessment, information that's coming via other routes, and making sure that when a new bit of engagement is started, we're really going back to those other sources and making sure that we're not starting from scratch every time with intelligence, that we're really properly pulling through the experiences that we heard last time we asked. We're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. So, for example, we've got the work that will be done shortly, I believe, on the strategic review of adult social care. Obviously, we want to hear from people, we want to understand their experiences, but are we going to pull through what we already know about people's experiences? Because I think we might find that people say they've been telling us quite a lot of stuff for the last year or even more about their experience, and how can we evidence that that has been heard and listened to? It's, I think, everyone's obviously rightly taken with the methodology described by Shahida in terms of listen, learn, reflection and action. It's the action part of that we need to demonstrate is happening. The first three bits, I think, are probably the easiest bits, and the action is the biggest challenge. So that's it. That's the sort of roundup of where we're at and what we've been hearing. In terms of the ask to the board, I think it's that really just about a reflection on how we hear from the people that we haven't heard from, and what we're doing to make sure that we act on what we have heard.
Thank you, Lucy, and I think we'll all appreciate. It's been I think currently a time where hearing from people that are service users or are affected by the issues here is never important, but also quite a difficult time to do that. So I think it's very important to reflect on who we are hearing from and who we're not. Do you have any questions for Lucy? And obviously, also remember we also got Judy, obviously, also with us. So any questions there at all? I'm not seeing any at the moment, but what I would say is that I think that central question there of who are we not hearing from, and what can we do in our organisation to change that? And I'm, very aware myself that, whilst many council social care service users are in some ways easily trackable, it's also at this time, I know from anecdotal experience, also a time where many people that receive council services have priorities that might not be speaking up for themselves, and we have to understand that, but also work to explain and help people understand, the importance of sharing experiences and help us improve services. So I think that's definitely something we need to pick up. Can I bring Terry in?
Let's just start. I'll keep this one brief. Just building on what you're saying there, George. There's a group perhaps of people we're not hearing from because we don't know that they're there. And as you say, there are people that in adult social care are easy to track, but there will be a degree of individuals who don't access adult social care that probably should or probably need to access adult social care. And I'm also interested in making sure we hear those, because if there's a barrier to a service, and that can come from all sorts of things, it can be difficult to access services, it can be because of a structural inequality that makes it harder for people to do that, or a mistrust or a suspicion of that, then actually, one of the things in improving that is making sure we hear that. I guess the big question is, are there things out there that we don't?
Thanks, Terry. I'm not sure I'm seeing any more contributions. What I would say is we will both hear again from Healthwatch before too long, and also we'll hopefully everyone will is aware of the current reports that Healthwatch have released fairly recently, but also I know there are some more things in process. So and Lucy's point about the engagement with the adult social care strategic work we're doing at the moment is very valuable. But absolutely, we need to make sure that is really adding value in terms of making sure that we are advancing where we're going on that. So so thank you to Lucy, and yeah, we will be hearing things again here. So right, I think all that really remains for us to do is to look at the minutes of the previous meeting, which we'll find in our packs, which would be our public meeting from the 25th of June. And I'll just take us through, presumably I'll take us through the pages here, and we will please just literally shout up if you've got any comments or amendments. So first page, second page. Oh, this is a lot of this is stuff to come today. Third page, fourth page, page 5, and page 6. Okay, is everyone okay with those minutes? I hope we are. And then finally, our next meeting in public, I believe, is on the 10th of December. But we will meet as a board privately, I believe, before that. So it's been a very, very long meeting today, and we've had some really, really important things that we need to. I think Terry wants to make a final comment before we.
Yeah, it may just be my audio, George, but when you went to mention the date, it went quiet. So if we could just repeat the date in case that the members of the public.
Next time we have a public meeting of the board, we are on the 10th of December. So yes, everyone very welcome again to tune into that, and I hope that we've still got lots of people with us. We shall see. So thank you all. It's been a really, really long meeting today, but actually really, really valuable. Probably need to look at how we manage the agendas to make sure we continue to have enough space to consider these really these issues of great magnitude. Thanks to those who joined the board today for the first time, and we look forward to seeing you back. And with that, I can like to close the meeting. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Are we out?